Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the leather boots of a medieval plague doctor, and trust me, you're going to wish you'd chosen literally any other profession. Picture this: you're standing in a cramped stone chamber, candlelight flickering across walls stained with God knows what, as you pull on an ankle-length black leather coat that weighs about as much as a small child. The leather creaks ominously with each movement, and you can already feel sweat beading on your forehead, and you haven't even put on the mask yet. You reach for that infamous beaked monstrosity hanging on the wall like some sort of medieval Halloween nightmare. The thing weighs a solid 5 pounds and smells like a combination of old herbs, previous owner's breath, and what you're pretty sure is mold. As you lower it over your head, the world suddenly becomes a narrow tunnel viewed through 2 small glass eye holes that fog up with every exhale. Congratulations, you just transformed yourself into the stuff of children's nightmares and adults' worst fears. You probably won't survive this job, but hey, at least you look mysterious. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love hearing from night owls around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1348, and Europe is in the grip of the Black Death. You've somehow landed the job of plague doctor, which is sort of like being appointed chief disaster manager on the Titanic. Your official title sounds impressive, medicus pestilentia, but the reality is that you're basically a walking scarecrow in a leather coat, armed with medical knowledge that would make a modern-day WebMD search look like cutting-edge research. Your costume, because let's be honest, that's really what it is, serves multiple purposes, most of them psychological. That ridiculous beak isn't just for show. It's stuffed with herbs, spices, and aromatic substances that medieval people believed would protect you from the bad air or miasma that supposedly carried the plague. Rosemary, thyme, lavender, mint, and sometimes even crushed pearls or powdered unicorn horn if your employer was feeling particularly generous or desperate. The theory was that good smells would overpower the evil disease-carrying odors. It's roughly equivalent to trying to stop a charging rhino with a bouquet of flowers. But hey, at least you smell better than everyone else. The long leather coat reaches down to your ankles, treated with various substances that were supposed to repel disease, everything from wax to suet to sometimes even ground-up precious stones. The idea was that the smooth surface wouldn't allow the pestilence to cling to you. You're essentially wearing a medieval hazmat suit designed by people who thought leeches were a reasonable treatment for headaches. Your accessories complete the ensemble of medieval medical theater. You carry a long wooden or metal rod, your plague stick, which serves multiple purposes. It's for examining patients without touching them, for lifting clothing to check for buboes, for pointing at things dramatically, and occasionally for defending yourself when desperate families try to blame you for their loved ones' deaths. Some doctors also carried hourglasses to time their visits, because apparently even in the midst of apocalyptic plague, someone needed to keep track of billable hours. The gloves extend nearly to your elbows and are made of thick leather, often goat skin, because medieval people believed certain animals were naturally resistant to plague. Your boots are similarly treated and come up over your knees. The entire outfit is designed to create a barrier between you and the diseased world, which would be a sound principle if anyone actually understood what they were trying to prevent. But here's where it gets really fun. Medieval people didn't understand contagion the way we do today. They had no concept of bacteria or viruses. Disease was thought to be caused by everything from bad air to angry gods to unfavorable planetary alignments. So while your costume might accidentally provide some protection against fleas, the actual plague carrier sits primarily designed to combat threats that exist only in medieval imagination. The psychological impact of your appearance cannot be overstated. When people see you walking down the street, children run screaming, adults cross themselves and mutter prayers, and even dogs seem to sense that something is fundamentally wrong with the world. You're not just a doctor, you're a walking reminder that death is stalking the streets. Your presence in a household often causes more panic than comfort, which is probably not the therapeutic effect you were hoping for. The beak itself is actually based on medieval theories about bird anatomy. People noticed that carrion birds like ravens and vultures seemed to be able to handle dead, diseased flesh without getting sick. So they reasoned that a bird-like appearance might confer similar protection. It's the kind of magical thinking that also led to treatments like wearing amulets made of toad skin or drinking powdered emeralds mixed with wine. Your eyepieces are made of glass, a luxury item in medieval times, and they fog up constantly. Between the restricted vision, the muffled hearing, and the fact that you're basically wearing a sauna, you're operating at about 30% of your normal sensory capacity. This is problematic when you're trying to diagnose diseases or navigate plague-ridden streets filled with debris, bodies, and very angry people who blame you for everything. The worst part? You genuinely believe this outfit works. Medical education in the 14th century was based largely on ancient Greek and Roman texts, particularly the works of Galen and Hippocrates, filtered through centuries of scholarly debate and religious interpretation. You've spent years learning to balance the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and you're convinced that disease results from an imbalance of these bodily fluids. The plague, in your learned opinion, is clearly caused by corruption of the air, possibly influenced by a malign conjunction of planets. So when you put on this elaborate costume, you're not just playing dress, you're implementing cutting-edge medieval medical technology. You've studied at universities like Bologna or Padua, where the finest medical minds of the age have taught you to interpret urine by color and smell, to read astrological charts to determine the best times for bloodletting, and to diagnose ailments by examining the alignment of stars at the moment of birth. The tragic irony is that some aspects of your costume might actually help. The full body coverage could potentially reduce exposure to infected fleas, and the long stick keeps you at a distance from coughing patients. But these benefits are purely accidental. You're like a medieval version of someone wearing a colander as a helmet who accidentally deflects a bullet. Historians still argue whether the plague doctor costume was more effective at protecting the doctor or traumatizing the patients, but most agree it was probably better at the latter. The psychological impact was so profound that the image of the plague doctor became permanently seared into European cultural memory, showing up in everything from carnival masks to horror movies centuries later. The process of getting dressed each morning becomes a ritual of psychological preparation. You start with the undergarments, a linen shirt and woolen hose that will be soaked with sweat within an hour. Then comes the leather doublet, the heavy coat, the gloves that make your hands feel like clubs, and finally the mask that transforms you from human being to walking nightmare. The herbs inside your beak need to be refreshed regularly, which means you're constantly smelling like a medieval spice cabinet. Cloves, cinnamon, dried roses, juniper berries all mixed together in a potpourri that's supposed to ward off death itself. Some doctors even included more exotic ingredients like ambergris or musk, turning their beaks into expensive perfume diffusers that happen to look like bird heads. The physical discomfort is extraordinary. The leather coat doesn't breathe at all, so you're essentially marinating in your own sweat from dawn to dusk. The mask restricts your breathing, making every inhalation feel labored and every exhalation fog up your vision. Your field of view is reduced to 2 small circles, and the weight of the beak throws off your balance, making you prone to walking into door frames, tripping over cobblestones, and generally appearing even more ominous than intended. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of your costume is how it changes your voice. The beak acts like a primitive voice box, giving your words a hollow, echoing quality that sounds vaguely inhuman. When you speak to patients or their families, your voice emerges from this bird-like apparatus as a muffled, otherworldly sound that reinforces everyone's belief that you're somehow connected to the supernatural forces causing the plague. Your daily equipment check reads like an inventory of medieval medical delusions. Alongside your protective gear, you carry a leather bag containing your surgical instruments, crude knives for bloodletting, primitive syringes for administering enemas, and various implements for the always popular practice of cupping, which involves heating glass cups and placing them on the skin to draw out bad blood. You also carry vials of various medicines, most of which are either useless or actively harmful mercury compounds, antimony preparations, and concoctions made from crushed beetles or powdered mummy. The costume serves another crucial function that its designers probably didn't intend. It makes you utterly anonymous. Behind the mask and layers of leather, you could be anyone. This anonymity becomes both a blessing and a curse. It protects your identity when treatments fail and families seek someone to blame, but it also isolates you from human connection at a time when compassion might be the only real medicine you can offer. You quickly discover that the costume is not designed for summer weather. Medieval Europe in the 14th century experiences some brutally hot summers, and wearing a full leather suit with a 5-pound mask feels like being slowly roasted alive. You develop heat rash in places you didn't know you could get heat rash, and dehydration becomes a constant threat. Many plague doctors actually collapse from heat exhaustion before they ever encounter a patient. The maintenance of your costume becomes an obsession born of desperation. You spend hours each day cleaning the leather, refreshing the herbs, polishing the glass eyepieces, and checking for any tears or damage that might compromise your protection. This ritualistic care of your gear provides a sense of control in a world that has clearly spiraled beyond anyone's ability to manage. Your walking stick becomes an extension of your personality, and different doctors develop their own personal styles of using it. Some brandish it like a scepter, others use it to maintain a theatrical distance from their patients, and a few treat it like a divining rod, waving it around as if it might magically detect disease. The stick also serves as a primitive measuring device. You learn to judge the severity of a plague outbreak by how many times per day you need to use it to move aside dead bodies blocking your path. The social dynamics of being a plague doctor are unlike anything else in medieval society. You exist in a strange liminal space between the living and the dead, between the sacred and the profane, between hope and despair. People simultaneously revere and revile you, seeing you as both potential savior and harbinger of doom. Children are taught to fear your appearance, while adults desperately seek your attention when disease strikes their households. Your medical education was supposed to prepare you for this moment, but as you stand over your first plague victim, you're beginning to suspect that 7 years of university might have been 7 years of very expensive nonsense. You've memorized every word of Galen's theories about the 4 humors. You can recite Hippocrates backwards in Latin, and you know exactly which saints to pray to for different ailments. What you don't know is why none of this is working on people who are literally dying in front of you. Let's take a journey back to your student days, shall we? You spent your early 20s hunched over manuscripts in drafty monastery libraries, copying out medical texts by candlelight until your eyes watered and your back ached. The University of Bologna's medical program was considered the finest in Europe, which tells you something about the state of European medicine. Your professors were learned men who could debate the finer points of whether bloodletting should be performed during a waxing or waning moon, but who had probably never seen an actual human body opened up for examination. Your first year was devoted entirely to logic and philosophy, because apparently you needed to understand Aristotle before you could figure out why people were coughing up blood. You studied rhetoric and grammar, learned to argue both sides of any medical question, and mastered the art of sounding authoritative while being completely wrong. The medieval university system believed that if you could debate whether angels had navels, you were qualified to treat bubonic plague. Year 2 brought you face to face with the works of Avicenna, the Persian physician whose canon of medicine was considered the ultimate medical textbook. You memorized his descriptions of diseases you'd never seen, treatments you'd never tried, and anatomical structures that existed mainly in his imagination. Avicenna was brilliant for his time, but his time was the 11th century, and medical knowledge had basically been frozen in amber for 300 years. The curriculum included astrology. Naturally, because how could you possibly treat a patient without knowing whether Mercury was in retrograde? You learned to cast horoscopes for your patients, to time medical procedures according to lunar cycles, and to blame treatment failures on unfavorable planetary alignments. It's like getting a degree in automotive repair and spending half your time studying the migratory patterns of butterflies. Your professors taught you that the human body contained 4 basic fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that all disease resulted from these humors being out of balance. Too much blood made you hot-tempered and prone to fever. Too much phlegm made you sluggish and pale. Yellow bile caused anger and digestive problems, while black bile led to melancholy and despair. It was a beautifully simple system that explained everything and cured nothing. Bloodletting was considered the Swiss Army knife of medieval medicine, useful for virtually every condition. Headache, bloodletting. Fever, bloodletting. Broken leg? Well, obviously the bone was broken because there was too much hot blood putting pressure on it. So bloodletting. You learned dozens of different techniques of dissection with a knife, cupping with heated glass vessels, and the always popular application of leeches to various body parts. The university owned exactly 1 human skeleton, which was kept in a locked cabinet and brought out maybe twice a year for special demonstrations. Most of your anatomical education came from studying pig carcasses and making wild assumptions about how human anatomy might differ. This led to some interesting misconceptions, like the belief that women had fewer ribs than men, or that the liver had multiple lobes arranged in ways that would make modern anatomists weep. Dissection of human bodies was technically legal but rarely practiced, partly due to religious objections and partly because nobody really wanted to find out that Galen had been wrong about pretty much everything. The few dissections that did occur were ceremonial affairs where a professor would read from ancient texts while a barber surgeon did the actual cutting, and everyone would politely ignore any anatomical discoveries that contradicted the classical authorities. Your surgical training consisted mainly of learning to set bones, remove arrows, and perform the occasional amputation with a saw and a bottle of wine for anesthesia. Surgery was considered a lower form of medicine, something for barbers and butchers rather than university-trained physicians. Real doctors diagnosed ailments through learned observation and prescribed medicines based on ancient wisdom. Getting your hands dirty with actual cutting was beneath your dignity. Pharmacology was where medieval medicine really got creative. You learned to compound medicines from everything imaginable: ground pearls for heart conditions, powdered unicorn horn for poison, crushed emeralds for eye problems, and mummy dust for practically everything else. The more expensive and exotic the ingredient, the more powerful it was presumed to be. Poor people got herbs and prayers. Rich people got pulverized precious stones and imported spices. Your professors taught you to diagnose diseases by examining urine, which involved studying its color, smell, consistency, and taste. Yes, taste. Medieval physicians actually tasted their patients' urine to check for sweetness, saltiness, or other flavors that might indicate specific ailments. You spent weeks learning to distinguish between the 17 different shades of yellow that supposedly corresponded to various conditions. It was like becoming a wine sommelier, but with bodily fluids. The medical texts you studied were copies of copies of copies, each one introducing new errors and misinterpretations. By the time Galen's original Greek writings had been translated into Arabic, then into Latin, then copied by monks who didn't understand medicine, the instructions for treating a simple fever might have transformed into a recipe for summoning demons. But these were the authoritative sources, so you memorized every word and treated them as gospel truth. Historians still argue whether medieval medical education was more harmful than helpful, but most agree that it produced doctors who were supremely confident in treatments that didn't work. The combination of classical authority, religious doctrine, and academic prestige created physicians who could explain exactly why their patients were dying, even as they continued to die. Your training included extensive study of what were called critical days, specific days in the course of an illness when the patient would either recover or die. These days were calculated based on astrological factors, the patient's temperament, and various numerical systems derived from ancient sources. You could predict with great authority that a fever would break on the 7th day, and when it didn't, you could explain that the patient's spiritual condition had obviously interfered with the natural healing process. The concept of contagion existed in medieval medicine, but it was understood in completely backwards ways. Diseases were thought to spread through corrupt air, evil vapors, or spiritual contamination rather than through actual physical contact. This led to treatments that focused on purifying the air with incense and prayers while ignoring basic sanitary precautions that might have actually helped. Your professors were masters of what modern people would recognize as confirmation bias. When a treatment worked, it proved the validity of ancient wisdom. When it failed, it meant the patient had committed sins, or the planets were unfavorable, or the medicine hadn't been prepared correctly. The system was designed to be unfalsifiable, which made it intellectually satisfying and practically useless. Clinical experience was limited to observing your professors treat wealthy patients in controlled settings. You never worked in charity hospitals or treated large numbers of sick people. Your education was entirely theoretical, based on reading about diseases rather than actually encountering them. It's like learning to drive by reading automotive manuals without ever seeing a car. The university system actively discouraged experimentation or innovation. Students who questioned ancient authorities were accused of arrogance or heresy. The goal wasn't to advance medical knowledge, but to preserve and transmit the wisdom of the past. You were being trained to be a custodian of medical tradition, not a healer or researcher. Your final examinations consisted of defending theses based on classical texts, debating hypothetical medical scenarios, and demonstrating your ability to quote authorities from memory. You were never actually required to cure anyone or demonstrate practical medical skills. The system produced graduates who could argue brilliantly about theoretical medicine while being completely helpless in front of actual sick people. The irony is that some traditional remedies actually worked, but for entirely wrong reasons. Willow bark tea, prescribed for its ability to balance the humors, actually contains salicin, precursor to aspirin. Digitalis, used because its purple flowers resembled certain disease symptoms, is actually an effective heart medication. Medieval medicine occasionally stumbled onto effective treatments while pursuing completely incorrect theories. Your medical bag contains an assortment of implements that would look more at home in a torture chamber than a hospital. Phlegm blades for bloodletting, cupping vessels for drawing blood to the surface, clister syringes for administering enemas, and various saws and knives for more drastic interventions. Each tool comes with elaborate instructions about when and how to use it, most of which are based on astrological calculations rather than medical necessity. The drug compounds you carry are works of art in their own way, if art can be defined as expensive substances mixed together according to ancient recipes. Theriac, the supposed universal antidote, contains over 60 ingredients including viper's flesh, opium, and various exotic spices. It takes months to prepare properly and costs more than most people earn in a year. Whether it actually cures anything is beside the point. It's the most expensive medicine available, so it must be the best. Now, standing in your ridiculous costume with your bag full of useless implements, you're starting to realize that your expensive education has prepared you for absolutely nothing. The plague doesn't care about your theories. The dying don't have time for your learned debates. And the families watching their loved ones suffer want results, not explanations about planetary influences and humoral imbalances. The smell hits you first, always. It's a layered assault on your nostrils that somehow manages to penetrate even the aromatic herbs stuffed in your beaked, nauseating cocktail of human waste. Rotting flesh, unwashed bodies, and desperation that seems to cling to the inside of your mask no matter how much lavender you pack into it. You're walking through the narrow cobblestone streets of a medieval city during a plague outbreak, and you're beginning to understand why your professors never included olfactory endurance in the medical curriculum. The streets themselves are a medieval health inspector's nightmare, though of course no such inspector exists. Raw sewage flows in open gutters down the middle of most roads, mixing with rainwater, animal droppings, and whatever else people decide to throw out their windows. The practice of simply opening your shutters and hurling the contents of your chamber pot into the street below is so common that people actually shout, "Gardes low! Watch out for the water before letting loose." Though water is being rather generous about what's actually cascading down from the second-story windows. You navigate this obstacle course of human waste while wearing a leather costume that severely restricts your vision and mobility. Your glass eyepieces fog up constantly from your own breathing, and the narrow field of view means you're essentially walking through a tunnel of limited awareness. You learn to move slowly and test each step, because slipping and falling in a plague-infected city could be a literal death sentence, assuming the embarrassment doesn't kill you first. The bodies are everywhere, and they're in various stages of decomposition that your medieval medical training somehow failed to prepare you for. Some are freshly dead, still warm and recognizably human. Others have been lying in alleys for days, bloated and discolored in ways that make your stomach churn even through the supposedly protective barrier of your aromatic herbs. The city's corpse collection system has completely broken down. The men who normally cart away the dead have either fled, died themselves, or refused to work for the pittance they're being paid. You develop a peculiar relationship with death that would probably concern modern psychiatrists. After your first week, you stop seeing corpses as former people and start viewing them as navigational hazards. That body blocking the doorway to the apothecary shop isn't someone's beloved father anymore. It's just an obstacle that needs to be moved with your plague stick so you can get inside to buy more useless medicines. The living aren't much better off than the dead, and in many cases they smell considerably worse. Personal hygiene in medieval Europe was already questionable under normal circumstances, but during a plague outbreak it becomes virtually non-existent. People are too sick to wash, too frightened to leave their houses, and too poor to afford clean water even if they wanted it. You encounter patients who haven't bathed in months, wearing clothes that have literally rotted off their bodies. Medieval people believed that bathing was actually dangerous during plague outbreaks because it opened the pores and allowed evil vapors to enter the body. So while you're struggling to breathe through your herb-stuffed mask, your patients are actively avoiding the one thing that might actually help prevent disease transmission. It's like trying to fight a fire while everyone around you insists that water makes flames stronger. The plague victims themselves present a horrifying array of symptoms that your university education described in sanitized Latin terms but never prepared you to actually witness. Bubonic plague causes lymph nodes to swell into grotesque, painful masses called buboestipically in the groin, armpits, and neck. These can grow to the size of chicken eggs and eventually burst, releasing a nauseating mixture of pus and blood. The pneumonic form attacks the lungs, causing victims to cough up bright red, frothy blood that spatters everything within reach. Your patients often develop a condition called acral gangrene, where their fingers, toes, and sometimes entire hands and feet turn black and literally rot away while they're still alive. The smell of gangrenous flesh is unlike anything else in the medieval olfactory experience suite, putrid, and stomach-churning in a way that somehow penetrates your aromatic defenses and lodges itself permanently in your memory. The septicemic form of plague is perhaps the most disturbing because victims can appear relatively healthy one moment and be dead within hours. Their skin develops dark patches that look like bruises but are actually areas where blood vessels have burst under the skin. Medieval people called this the Black Death, not just because of its mortality rate, but because victims literally turned black before dying. You quickly discover that your plague stick isn't just for medical examinations, it becomes essential for basic navigation through plague-stricken areas. You use it to move aside debris, push open doors you don't want to touch with your hands, and probe suspicious lumps under blankets to determine whether they're sleeping patients or decomposing corpses. The stick becomes an extension of your body, a barrier between you and the contaminated world you're supposed to be healing. The psychological impact of constant exposure to death and decay begins to affect your mental state in ways your professors never mentioned. You develop a strange emotional numbness that allows you to function but makes you question whether you're still fully human. You can examine a bubo-covered child with the same clinical detachment you once reserved for studying pig anatomy, and you're not sure whether this represents professional competence or complete moral breakdown. The air quality in plague-stricken cities defies description. Beyond the obvious problems of human waste and decomposing bodies, there's the acrid smoke from the constant burning of purifying substances, sulfur, pitch, and various herbs that people believe will cleanse the corrupted air. The city becomes permanently shrouded in a haze that burns your eyes and makes breathing difficult even without a plague mask. Your daily route takes you through neighborhoods that have been completely abandoned, where entire families have died behind locked doors and their bodies are slowly mummifying in their own homes. You learn to recognize the signs of household extinction, the smell seeping under doors, the accumulated mail and deliveries, the pets wandering the streets looking for owners who will never return. The rats are everywhere, fat and bold and completely unafraid of humans. They've learned that cities during plague outbreaks are essentially all-you-can-eat buffets of human flesh, and they've multiplied to biblical proportions. You watch them scurrying in and out of houses, and you notice that they seem to be dying in unusual numbers. But your medical training hasn't taught you to connect rat mortality with human disease. The rats are just another unpleasant aspect of an already nightmarish situation. The insects present their own special horror. Flies swarm around every corpse and wound, creating black, buzzing clouds that seem to follow you wherever you go. Fleas are so numerous that they form visible moving carpets on the clothing of the dead and living alike. You find yourself constantly brushing bugs off your leather costume, never realizing that these insects are actually the primary vectors for the disease you're trying to treat. Water sources become contaminated almost immediately when plague strikes a city. Wells get filled with corpses, either accidentally or deliberately. Rivers become repositories for human waste and dead bodies. The few clean water sources that remain are jealously guarded by armed men who charge exorbitant prices for a single cup of water that might or might not be safe to drink. Your aromatic herbs provide psychological comfort but no real protection against the overwhelming assault on your senses. You experiment with different combinations: more cloves for the sweet smell of decay, extra mint for the sewage odors, crushed roses to combat the general stench of unwashed humanity. But nothing really works. The smell of plague becomes a permanent fixture in your consciousness, following you home at night and appearing in your dreams. The worst part isn't the dead bodies or even the dying patients, it's the living relatives who still have hope. They look at you with desperate expectation, believing that your elaborate costume and university training mean you can work miracles. They offer you their life savings for treatments you know won't work. They beg you to save their children while you're mentally calculating how long it will be before the entire family is dead. You develop a complicated relationship with your own bodily functions. Every slight headache becomes a potential plague symptom. Every upset stomach could be the beginning of the end. You spend hours examining your own body for buboes, checking your urine for unusual colors, and monitoring your breathing for signs of pneumonic infection. The constant stress of believing you might be incubating your own death becomes almost as debilitating as the actual disease. The sounds of a plague city are as disturbing as the smells. There's a constant background noise of moaning, crying, and praying that creates an atmosphere of permanent despair. Church bells ring constantly for funeral services, creating a soundtrack of death that never stops. The normal sounds of city life merchants hawking their wares, children playing, lovers singing disappear entirely, replaced by the acoustics of mass dying. Historians still argue whether plague doctors were more traumatized by what they saw or by their inability to help, but most agree that very few emerged from the experience psychologically intact. The combination of constant exposure to death, complete medical helplessness, and social isolation created mental health problems that wouldn't be formally recognized for centuries. The architecture of medieval cities becomes your enemy during plague outbreaks. Buildings are crammed together with virtually no space between them, creating perfect conditions for disease transmission. Narrow alleys funnel contaminated air and provide no escape routes when you encounter dangerous situations. The multi-story construction means that waste and infection rain down from above, while the poor foundations allow contamination to seep up from below. You learn to read the landscape of disease in ways that would make modern epidemiologists envious, if they could stomach the methodology. Houses with red X marks painted on the doors contain confirmed plague cases. Piles of lime outside buildings indicate recent deaths and hasty burials. Boarded-up windows mean everyone inside is either dead or dying. You develop an entire visual vocabulary of urban decay that helps you navigate the geography of death. The animals in plague-stricken cities behave in disturbing ways that add to the overall atmosphere of wrongness. Dogs form packs and become aggressive, feeding on corpses and attacking living humans who appear weak. Cats disappear entirely, either dead from plague or fled to cleaner territories. Pigs, normally confined to pens, wander freely through streets and houses, growing fat on human remains. The natural order of urban life collapses along with human society. Your leather boots become caked with substances you prefer not to identify. The soles build up layers of organic matter that create a permanent platform of compressed filth beneath your feet. You develop a distinctive walk that minimizes contact between your footwear and any surface, leading to a peculiar mincing gait that makes you look even more otherworldly than your costume already suggests. The winter months present unique challenges that somehow make the already horrific situation even worse. Corpses freeze solid in the streets, creating macabre ice sculptures that persist for months. The cold slows decomposition, which might sound like a blessing until you realize it means the bodies accumulate faster than they can decay. Spring thaw brings its own nightmare as months of frozen waste and flesh suddenly liquefy all at once. Your plague mask becomes a repository for the concentrated essence of medieval urban decay. Despite regular cleaning and herb replacement, it develops its own unique bouquet that combines all the worst smells you've encountered. You begin to suspect that the mask is actually making the olfactory assault worse by concentrating and focusing odors that might otherwise dissipate. But removing it isn't an option, so you learn to breathe shallowly and think about other things. The economic collapse that accompanies plague outbreaks creates additional layers of urban decay. Markets shut down, leaving food to rot in abandoned stalls. Merchants flee with their goods, creating shortages that lead to hoarding and violence. The currency system breaks down as people realize that money can't buy survival when there's nothing left to purchase. The streets fill with valuable objects that no one alive wants or can use. You witness the complete breakdown of medieval urban infrastructure in real time. The guild system collapses as entire professions die out. The city watch disappears, leaving law enforcement to whoever has the biggest sword. Public works cease as the men who normally maintain streets and buildings either die or flee. The city begins to physically crumble even as its population dissolves. The moment you step through the doorway of your first plague house, you realize that your elaborate costume hasn't made you a healer, it's made you a walking symbol of impending doom. The family clustered around their dying patriarch looks at you with a mixture of desperate hope and barely concealed terror, and you can practically see their faith in your abilities evaporating as you awkwardly maneuver your beak-headed bulk through their narrow doorframe. You're carrying your leather bag full of expensive medicines and surgical tools, wearing a costume that cost more than most people earn in a decade, and armed with 7 years of university education. Yet the first words out of the eldest son's mouth are you here to help father die, or to kill him faster?" It's not exactly the enthusiastic reception your professors led you to expect from grateful patients eager for your learned intervention. The dynamic becomes clear almost immediately. You're not a doctor in these people's mind-theory, a harbinger of death, a crow in human form who appears when hope is already lost. Children scream and hide when they see you coming. Adults cross themselves and mutter prayers for protection, not from the plague, but from you. Your very presence in a household is seen as confirmation that the situation has moved beyond ordinary medicine into the realm of last rites and funeral preparations. Your first few attempts at bedside manner are disasters of epic proportions. You try to project confidence and authority, but your voice comes out of the beak as a muffled, otherworldly sound that makes patients think they're being visited by supernatural entities. You attempt to lean in for closer examination of symptoms, but the weight and bulk of your costume makes you clumsy and threatening. Your plague stick, meant to maintain a safe distance, becomes a barrier that prevents any genuine human connection. The families blame you for everything that goes wrong, which is essentially everything. When a patient dies despite your bloodletting, it's because you didn't remove enough bad blood. When they survive the bloodletting but die anyway, it's because you weakened them too much. When your expensive theriac medicine fails to cure their plague symptoms, it's because you diluted it or gave them the wrong dosage. You quickly learn that being a plague doctor means accepting responsibility for failures while receiving credit for exactly nothing. The social dynamics of plague medicine create impossible situations that your university training never addressed. Families often refuse to pay for treatments that don't work, which is all of them. They demand refunds for medicines that didn't cure their relatives, as if medical practice came with a money-back guarantee. Some threaten violence when their loved ones die under your care, apparently believing that university education includes the ability to reverse divine judgment. Your reputation spreads through plague-stricken neighborhoods faster than the disease itself. Families share stories about that useless bird doctor who couldn't cure anything, and your arrival at a new house is often greeted with eye-rolling and resigned sighs rather than hope. Children make up songs about your failures, and adults use your name as a synonym for expensive incompetence. You develop thick skin out of necessity, but the constant criticism wears you down in ways you didn't anticipate. Every day brings fresh accusations of fraud, incompetence, or worse. Families who invited you to save their loved ones end up cursing your name and blaming you for deaths that would have occurred regardless of your intervention. You begin to wonder if maybe you really are some kind of curse, spreading death wherever you go. The medical procedures you perform become theatrical productions of failure. When you attempt bloodletting, your leather gloves make it nearly impossible to feel for veins, and your fogged-up eyepieces prevent you from seeing what you're doing. You end up making multiple cuts, causing unnecessary pain, and frequently fail to draw any blood at all. Families watch this fumbling performance and conclude that you're either incompetent or deliberately torturing their relative. Your diagnostic methods inspire more mockery than confidence. When you solemnly examine a patient's urine through your plague mask, holding the glass vial up to your beak like some bizarre wine tasting, families struggle not to laugh at the absurdity. Your attempts to feel for pulse and temperature through thick leather gloves produce random results that have no connection to the patient's actual condition. Your astrological calculations, performed with great ceremony using charts and instruments, strike most people as elaborate fortune-telling with medical pretensions. The language barrier between your university Latin and the common vernacular of your patients creates additional problems. You've been trained to discuss medical conditions in scholarly terms that mean nothing to ordinary people. When you explain that their father is suffering from an excess of melancholic humors complicated by planetary maleficence, they stare at you blankly and ask if he's going to live or die. Your inability to communicate in plain language makes you seem pretentious and out of touch with the reality of their suffering. Families often know more about practical nursing care than you do, having tended sick relatives for years using traditional remedies passed down through generations. They watch you fumble with basic tasks like checking for fever or examining wounds, and they realize that their grandmother's herbal teas are probably more effective than your expensive university medicines. Your theoretical knowledge crumbles when confronted with practical caregiving skills you never learned. The economic tensions surrounding your visits create additional hostility. You charge fees that represent months of income for most families, and you demand payment regardless of outcomes. When treatments fail and patients die, families find themselves not only grieving but also bankrupted by medical expenses that accomplished nothing. You become associated with financial ruin as well as medical failure. Your plague costume becomes a target for popular anger in ways that go beyond medical disappointment. People see the expensive leather, the exotic herbs, the imported glass eyepieces, and they recognize symbols of wealth and privilege in a time when ordinary families are starving. Your elaborate outfit represents resources that could have fed dozens of families, used instead to create a costume that doesn't even work for its intended purpose. The psychological pressure of constant failure begins to affect your mental health in profound ways. You start second-guessing every decision, wondering if different treatments might have worked, questioning whether you're actually making patients worse instead of better. The weight of accumulated deaths follows you home each night, and you find yourself unable to sleep without seeing the faces of people you couldn't save. Your relationships with other medical professionals become strained as word spreads about your lack of success. Barber surgeons, who normally defer to university-trained physicians, begin questioning your methods openly. Apothecaries raise eyebrows when you order expensive compounds that never seem to cure anyone. Even clergy members, traditionally supportive of educated healers, start suggesting that perhaps prayer might be more effective than your medicines. The children are the worst critics because they haven't learned to be polite about adult failures. They point and giggle at your costume, make jokes about your beak, and ask loudly why you can't fix their sick relatives. They're innocent questions. If you're a real doctor, why is Mama still dying? Cut deeper than any adult criticism because they expose the fundamental absurdity of your situation with childlike directness. You begin to develop defensive mechanisms that make you even less likable to your patients and their families. You become pompous and condescending, hiding behind your university credentials and scholarly language. You blame patient deaths on their failure to follow your instructions precisely, their insufficient faith in your methods, or their spiritual unworthiness. These defensive strategies protect your ego but make families hate you even more. The physical limitations of your costume compound the social problems of your profession. You can't comfort dying patients with a reassuring touch through your thick leather gloves. You can't offer sympathetic facial expressions behind your bird-like mask. You can't speak in soothing tones through your muffled beak apparatus. Every aspect of your protective gear prevents the kind of human connection that might make your medical failures more bearable for grieving families. Your attempts to maintain professional dignity in the face of constant failure become increasingly desperate and absurd. You develop elaborate explanations for why your treatments don't work, blaming everything from patient diet to household pets to the phase of the moon. You create complex charts and calculations that supposedly prove your methods are sound, even when everyone you treat continues to die. Your insistence on scientific accuracy in the face of obvious failure makes you seem delusional. Historians still argue whether plague doctors were more hated for their medical failures or their social pretensions, but most agree that they became scapegoats for broader societal frustrations during plague outbreaks. When people needed someone to blame for the collapse of their world, the ineffective doctor in the ridiculous costume made a perfect target. The community begins to organize against you in ways that go beyond individual family complaints. Neighborhood groups petition local authorities to ban your services. Merchants refuse to sell you supplies. Innkeepers decline to give you lodging. You become a pariah in your own community, shunned by the very people you trained to serve. Your professional isolation becomes complete when you realize that other plague doctors are avoiding you. They don't want to be associated with your reputation for failure, even though their success rates are equally dismal. The medical community closes ranks against you, leaving you to face the hostility of plague-stricken neighborhoods entirely alone. The ultimate irony is that your elaborate costume and expensive education have made you less effective at providing comfort than any ordinary person with basic human sympathy. A neighbor woman with no medical training but a gentle manner can offer more meaningful help to dying patients than you can with all your scholarly knowledge and protective equipment. Your transformation into a plague doctor has somehow made you less human at precisely the moment when humanity is what people need most. The verbal abuse you receive becomes increasingly creative and personal as your reputation for failure spreads. Families develop elaborate insults specifically tailored to your bird-like appearance and medical incompetence. You're called everything from the angel of death with a shopping habit to the university-trained undertaker. Some of the more educated critics compose satirical poems about your failures, which get passed around neighborhoods like medieval memes. Your attempts at damage control only make the situation worse. When you try to explain the theoretical basis for your treatments, patients' families interpret your scholarly language as condescending gibberish. When you point out that plague medicine is inherently difficult and that other doctors are equally unsuccessful, they hear you making excuses for your failures. Every defensive response you offer confirms their belief that you're an arrogant fraud who cares more about protecting your reputation than helping sick people. The class dynamics of medieval society work against you in every interaction. Your expensive education and elaborate costume mark you as a member of the privileged elite, while your patients are ordinary working people who already distrust authority figures. The plague has created economic hardship that makes your fees even more burdensome, and families see you as someone profiting from their suffering while providing no real benefit. You discover that your medical training has actually made you worse at dealing with human suffering than people with no formal education. Your professors taught you to maintain clinical detachment and scholarly objectivity, but families want emotional engagement and genuine sympathy. Your ability to recite Latin medical terminology means nothing to a mother watching her child die. Your knowledge of astrological influences on disease provides no comfort to a widow planning her husband's funeral. The reputation you develop for bringing death follows you even into social situations unrelated to medicine. Tavern keepers notice that their establishments empty out when you arrive for a drink. Market vendors avoid eye contact and try not to serve you. Even prostitutes, who normally welcome anyone with money, refuse your business because they believe your presence will bring them bad luck. Your plague mask becomes a prison that isolates you from normal human interaction even when you're not working. The psychological effect of wearing it day after day begins to change your personality in ways you don't recognize. You start to see the world through the narrow lens of your eyepieces, both literally and metaphorically. Your field of vision becomes restricted, and so does your ability to understand other people's perspectives. The stress of constant hostility begins to manifest in physical symptoms that you recognize as potential signs of plague, creating a paranoia spiral that affects your judgment. Every headache could be the beginning of the end. Every stomach cramp might be the first sign of the disease you've been trying to treat. You become hypervigilant about your own health while remaining completely ineffective at treating anyone else's. Your family relationships suffer as your professional reputation destroys your social standing. Relatives become embarrassed to be associated with the neighborhood's most notorious medical failure. Marriage prospects disappear as potential partners learn about your profession and its associated stigma. You find yourself increasingly isolated, with only your expensive, ineffective medical equipment for company. The seasonal patterns of plague outbreaks create a cycle of hope and disappointment that tortures both you and your potential patients. Each winter, when the disease temporarily abates, you hope that maybe this time your treatments will work. Each spring, when the plague returns, you face renewed evidence of your complete medical incompetence. The cyclical nature of your failure creates a psychological rhythm of anticipation and despair. Your medical bag becomes a collection of expensive reminders of your inadequacy. Every bottle of medicine represents a treatment that didn't work. Every surgical instrument reminds you of procedures that failed to help. The weight of carrying these useless tools becomes a physical manifestation of the psychological burden of your professional failures. The church bells are tolling again this morning, which means someone else has died, and somehow it's probably going to be your fault. You've learned to interpret the rhythm of the bells like a medieval weather forecast. 3 slow tolls means an adult. Faster ringing indicates a child. And the ominous continuous pealing suggests that multiple deaths have overwhelmed the parish's ability to conduct individual funeral services. Today, it's the continuous pealing, and you know that by evening, at least half a dozen families will be blaming you for their losses. The relationship between medieval medicine and the church is complicated under the best of circumstances, but during a plague outbreak, it becomes a theological minefield that you're forced to navigate while wearing a ridiculous bird costume. The clergy preaches that disease is God's punishment for sin, which creates an impossible situation for you as a doctor. If you succeed in treating someone, you're interfering with divine justice. If you fail, you're proof that God's wrath cannot be thwarted by human arrogance. It's a lose-lose scenario that makes your already difficult job virtually impossible. Your first encounter with religious opposition comes from Father Benedict, the local parish priest who has appointed himself as the community's spiritual authority during the plague crisis. He's a thin, intense man with wild eyes who seems to believe that the Black Death represents the beginning of the apocalypse, and he views your medical interventions as attempts to thwart God's plan for humanity. When you arrive at the bedside of a plague victim, he's often already there, administering last rites and preparing the family for inevitable death. The theological debate about your role becomes a public spectacle that damages your reputation even further. Father Benedict argues from the pulpit that plague doctors are modern versions of the Tower of Babel human pride attempting to reach into God's domain through false learning and expensive tricks. He suggests that your university education has filled you with arrogance that blinds you to spiritual truth, and that your failures prove God's disapproval of scholarly medicine. You attempt to argue that God works through human hands, that your medical training is a gift from the divine that should be used to help suffering people. But your theological education is limited, and Father Benedict can quote scripture with the fluency of someone who has spent decades studying religious texts. He counters your arguments with biblical passages about the futility of human wisdom, the dangers of pride, and the importance of accepting God's will without question. The community watches these theological debates with fascination, and unfortunately for you, Father Benedict is a much better public speaker than you are. Your voice is muffled by your beak mask, Your arguments are delivered in academic Latin that most people don't understand, and your elaborate costume makes you look like a figure from a morality play about the dangers of worldly vanity. Father Benedict, meanwhile, speaks in plain language about familiar religious concepts, and his simple brown robes create a stark contrast with your expensive leather outfit. The religious interpretation of your failures becomes increasingly elaborate and damaging to your reputation. When patients die despite your treatments, Father Benedict explains that God is punishing the community for relying on human pride instead of divine mercy. When your medicines cause side effects, he suggests that demons are working through your potions to torment the faithful. When your bloodletting weakens patients, he claims that you're literally draining the life force that God has given them. Your attempts to incorporate religious elements into your medical practice backfire spectacularly. You begin each treatment session with prayers, hoping to demonstrate your piety and deflect theological criticism. But your Latin prayers, delivered through a bird mask while wearing leather gloves, sound more like demonic incantations than Christian devotion. Families who were already suspicious of your methods now suspect that you're conducting some kind of occult ritual over their dying relatives. The Church's position on plague causation creates additional problems for your medical practice. Official doctrine holds that the Black Death results from humanity's collective sinfulness, particularly the moral corruption of cities and the growing materialism of medieval society. This theological framework makes individual medical treatment seem pointless at best and blasphemous at worst. If plague is God's punishment for sin, then the proper response is repentance and prayer, not expensive medicines and university-trained doctors. You discover that many families are torn between their desperate desire to save their loved ones and their fear of offending God by seeking medical help. They call for your services in secret, then publicly denounce you to demonstrate their religious orthodoxy. This double standard creates a surreal situation where you're simultaneously the community's most sought-after and most vilified resident. The competition between medical and religious approaches to plague treatment becomes a public relations war that you're clearly losing. Father Benedict organizes prayer vigils, community fasting, and public repentance ceremonies that draw large crowds and create a sense of collective action against the plague. Your medical treatments, by contrast, are individual, expensive, and conducted behind closed doors with little community participation. The religious response feels like a social movement. Your medical approach feels like a private business transaction. Your theological knowledge proves inadequate for the complex religious questions that plague outbreaks raise. When families ask why God would allow innocent children to suffer, you have no good answers. When they wonder whether seeking medical treatment demonstrates insufficient faith in divine providence, you can only mumble uncertain responses about God working through human instruments. Father Benedict, meanwhile, has ready explanations for everything, even if those explanations are ultimately unsatisfying. The economic tensions between church and medicine become apparent as the plague continues. Religious ceremonies are essentially free, funded by voluntary donations and community support. Medical treatments are expensive, paid for by desperate families who often bankrupt themselves seeking cures that don't work. The contrast between free spiritual comfort and costly medical failure makes your profession look particularly mercenary and exploitative. Historians still argue whether medieval churches actively opposed medical treatment during plague outbreaks or simply offered alternative explanations for disease and death, but most agree that religious and medical authorities often found themselves in conflict during health crises. The Church's emphasis on spiritual causes and solutions didn't mesh well with medicine's focus on physical diagnosis and treatment. Your relationship with local clergy becomes increasingly strained as your medical failures accumulate. Priests who initially welcomed your services begin to question whether your presence in the community is actually making the spiritual situation worse. They suggest that your inability to cure patients is demoralizing the faithful and undermining trust in God's plan. Some openly call for you to leave the community entirely, arguing that your continued presence is a stumbling block to proper Christian response to divine judgment. The religious criticism of your methods becomes more sophisticated and damaging over time. Father Benedict develops elaborate theological arguments about why university medicine represents a form of practical atheism. He claims that your reliance on ancient Greek and Roman sources means you're following pagan wisdom rather than Christian truth. Your use of astrological calculations strikes him as a form of divination that borders on witchcraft. Even your anatomical knowledge, gained from studying corpses, seems to him like an unhealthy obsession with death and decay. You attempt to defend yourself by pointing out that many clergy members have university educations and that the church itself has traditionally supported learning and scholarship. But Father Benedict argues that there's a crucial difference between studying theology, which brings humans closer to God, and studying medicine, which encourages them to rely on their own abilities rather than divine grace. He suggests that your failures prove the fundamental bankruptcy of secular learning when confronted with spiritual realities. The community begins to organize religious responses to the plague that deliberately exclude you and your medical approach. They form prayer groups, organize pilgrimages to nearby shrines, and participate in public penance ceremonies designed to appease God's anger. These religious activities create a sense of community solidarity and purpose that your individual medical treatments cannot match. People feel like they're doing something meaningful to combat the plague, even if that something is essentially ineffective. Your costume becomes a symbol of everything the religious community finds objectionable about secular medicine. The elaborate leather outfit represents worldly wealth and vanity. The bird-like appearance suggests something fundamentally unnatural or demonic. The expensive herbs and exotic materials reinforce the impression that you're more concerned with impressive theatrics than genuine healing. Father Benedict uses your appearance as a visual aid in sermons about the dangers of pride and materialism. The theological implications of your treatment methods create problems you never anticipated during your university training. Bloodletting, one of your primary therapeutic tools, strikes some religious critics as a form of ritual sacrifice that mimics pagan practices. Your astrological calculations look like fortune-telling or sorcery. Your anatomical examinations seem to treat the human body as a mere physical mechanism rather than a sacred creation made in God's image. You begin to experience what modern people would recognize as a crisis of faith, though you lack the vocabulary to describe your spiritual struggles. The constant religious criticism makes you question whether your medical vocation is compatible with Christian belief. You wonder if your failures represent God's disapproval of your life choices, or if your education has somehow separated you from divine grace. The stress of theological uncertainty compounds the already overwhelming pressure of medical helplessness. The relationship between sin and sickness becomes a constant source of tension between you and the families you treat. Religious doctrine suggests that illness results from moral failings, which means that your patients are suffering because they deserve punishment. But medical practice requires you to show compassion and work to alleviate suffering regardless of its supposed spiritual causes. This contradiction creates ethical dilemmas that your training never addressed. Your attempts to find middle ground between religious and medical explanations for plague prove unsatisfying to everyone involved. When you suggest that God might be working through natural causes that medicine can address, religious critics accuse you of reducing divine action to mere physical processes. When you acknowledge that plague might represent divine judgment while still offering medical treatment, medical colleagues question your professional commitment to rational diagnosis and therapy. The competition for authority during plague outbreaks reveals fundamental tensions between religious and secular approaches to understanding human suffering. The Church offers explanations that provide meaning and hope, even if they don't cure anyone. Medicine offers treatments that occasionally work, but no satisfactory explanations for why some people live while others die. The community finds religious meaning more comforting than medical uncertainty, even when religion doesn't save lives. Word count: 4. 517. Awaiting, continue. The money situation is becoming desperate, and you're starting to realize that getting paid in promises might be an overly optimistic description of your current financial arrangement. You're supposedly treating the wealthiest families in plague-stricken cities, armed with expensive medicines and university credentials that should command premium prices. Yet somehow you're barely scraping together enough coins to afford a decent meal and a place to sleep. It turns out that being a plague doctor during the Black Death is about as lucrative as being a luxury cruise director on the Titanic. Your fee structure seemed reasonable when you established your practitia substantial sum for house calls, additional charges for medicines and procedures, and premium rates for emergency visits during nighttime hours. The problem is that plague medicine operates according to an entirely different economic logic than normal medical practice. When entire families are dying and city economies are collapsing, the usual rules about payment for professional services become meaningless. The first sign of financial trouble comes when you realize that most of your patients die regardless of treatment, which creates what economists might call a customer satisfaction problem. Families who have paid your hefty fees to save their loved ones feel understandably cheated when those loved ones die anyway. They demand refunds, refuse to pay outstanding bills, and warn other potential clients about your expensive failures. Word spreads quickly through plague-stricken neighborhoods that hiring you is equivalent to throwing money into a fire. Your attempts to collect payment become increasingly awkward and desperate. You find yourself standing in doorways wearing your ridiculous bird costume, trying to maintain professional dignity while essentially begging for money from grieving families who blame you for their losses. The combination of your intimidating appearance and your mercenary demands creates a public relations disaster that damages your reputation even further. The economics of plague medicine are fundamentally broken in ways that your university training never addressed. Normal medical practice involves treating patients who recover and then recommend your services to other potential clients. Plague medicine involves treating patients who die and leave behind bitter families who actively discourage others from hiring you. Your customer base literally dies off, taking their positive reviews with them to the grave. You discover that many families simply don't have the money to pay for medical treatment, regardless of their willingness to do so. The plague has disrupted normal economic activity, leaving even previously wealthy households cash poor and unable to afford your services. Merchants can't sell goods, craftsmen can't find customers, and farmers can't transport crops to market. The entire economic system is collapsing along with the population. The payment methods that do exist during plague outbreaks create their own problems. Some families offer to pay in goods rather than money livestock, grain, cloth, or household items that might have value under normal circumstances. But what are you supposed to do with a cow when you're living in temporary lodgings and traveling constantly between plague houses? You're not equipped to be a livestock merchant, and the markets for converting goods to cash have largely disappeared. Your expenses, meanwhile, continue to mount regardless of your income problems. The exotic herbs and spices for your beak mask must be constantly replenished and cost more during plague outbreaks when supply chains are disrupted. Your leather costume requires regular maintenance and occasional replacement as it wears out from constant use. The medicines in your bagmercury compounds, theriac, and various other preparations represent a small fortune in ingredients that produce no measurable results. The competition from cheaper alternatives makes your pricing structure increasingly untenable. While you're charging premium rates for university-trained medical services, local wise women and folk healers offer similar results for a fraction of the cost. Their herbal remedies don't work any better than your learned medicines, but they're much more affordable and delivered with greater warmth and compassion. Families begin to question why they should pay university prices for barbershop results. Your attempts to adjust your pricing to meet market realities create new problems. When you lower your fees to attract more clients, existing customers demand retroactive refunds for the higher prices they paid previously. When you offer payment plans or sliding scale fees based on ability to pay, word spreads that you're willing to negotiate, which undermines your authority and makes everyone think your original prices were artificially inflated. The social implications of your financial struggles become increasingly embarrassing. You're supposed to be a learned professional with university credentials and specialized expertise, but you're reduced to haggling over payment like a common merchant. Your elaborate costume and scholarly pretensions seem ridiculous when you're desperately trying to collect small debts from impoverished plague victims. You begin to suspect that some families are calling for your services with no intention of paying at all. They're so desperate to save their loved ones that they'll promise anything to get medical help, knowing that they can't afford your fees even if treatment succeeds. When patients die, these families claim that your failure absolves them of any payment obligation. When patients survive, they argue that natural recovery rather than medical intervention deserves the credit. The legal system offers no practical help for collecting medical debts during plague outbreaks. Courts are closed, judges have fled or died, and law enforcement has broken down along with every other aspect of civic life. Even if you could pursue legal remedies for unpaid bills, the process would take longer than most of your debtors are likely to survive. You're operating in a lawless environment where contracts and professional obligations have no meaningful enforcement mechanisms. Your relationship with suppliers becomes increasingly strained as your cash flow problems worsen. Apothecaries demand payment in advance for expensive medicine ingredients, knowing that plague doctors have a reputation for defaulting on their debts. Leather workers and equipment suppliers refuse to extend credit for costume maintenance and repairs. Even food vendors and innkeepers require immediate payment, treating you as a credit risk despite your supposedly prestigious profession. The irony of your financial situation becomes apparent when you realize that you're risking your life daily for essentially no compensation while other people are getting rich from plague-related economic opportunities. Coffin makers and grave diggers are earning more money than university-trained physicians. Merchants who stockpile food and medicine can charge whatever prices they want to desperate customers. Even petty criminals are doing better financially, looting abandoned houses and robbing fleeing families. Your attempts to diversify your income streams lead to increasingly desperate measures that damage your professional reputation. You start offering services that fall outside traditional medical practice, writing wills for dying patients, serving as a messenger between quarantined families, even helping with basic household tasks when regular servants have fled or died. These activities pay better than medicine but make you look more like a general laborer than a learned physician. The seasonal nature of plague outbreaks creates additional financial planning challenges. The disease tends to peak during summer months and decline during winter, which means your income fluctuates wildly throughout the year. You need to earn enough during plague season to survive the lean months when there's little demand for your specialized services. But the intensity of plague work makes it difficult to plan for long-term financial stability. Your family relationships suffer as your financial problems worsen. Relatives who initially viewed your medical career with pride begin to question whether you should have pursued a more stable profession. Your inability to provide for your own household while supposedly helping others creates tension and resentment. Some family members suggest that you should abandon medicine entirely and find work that actually pays a living wage. The psychological impact of financial stress compounds the already overwhelming pressure of medical failure. You're not just watching patients die despite your best efforts, you're going bankrupt in the process. The combination of professional helplessness and economic insecurity creates a level of personal crisis that threatens your mental health and your commitment to continuing medical practice. Your living arrangements become increasingly precarious as landlords refuse to rent to plague doctors who might not be able to pay their bills. You're forced to accept whatever lodging you can find, often in the worst parts of plague-stricken cities where desperate landlords will take any tenant willing to pay in advance. Your housing situation becomes another symbol of your professional failure and social decline. The equipment and supplies necessary for plague medicine represent a substantial ongoing investment that your income can't support. Your leather costume alone costs more than most people earn in several months, and it needs constant maintenance and eventual replacement. Your medical instruments require sharpening and repair. Your medicines spoil and must be replenished regularly. You're operating what amounts to a small business with high overhead costs and virtually no reliable income. Your attempts to establish credit arrangements with local merchants fail because everyone knows that plague doctors have short life expectancies. Suppliers are unwilling to extend credit to someone who might be dead before the next payment comes due. This creates a vicious cycle where your inability to get credit makes it harder to maintain your practice, which makes you even less creditworthy. The community's attitude toward your financial struggles reveals the complex social dynamics of plague-stricken cities. Some people express sympathy for your difficult situation, recognizing that you're risking your life to help others even when you can't afford to do so. But others view your money problems as evidence of divine judgment against your ineffective methods. Your poverty becomes another mark against your professional credibility. Historians still argue whether plague doctors were typically well compensated for their dangerous work or exploited by communities that desperately needed medical services but couldn't afford to pay for them. But most agree that the economic disruption caused by plague outbreaks made normal payment arrangements impossible to maintain. The currency itself becomes problematic during plague outbreaks as confidence in economic institutions collapses. People hoard gold and silver coins, believing that precious metals will retain value better than promises from dying governments. Paper money and credit instruments become worthless when the institutions that issued them cease to function. You find yourself operating in an increasingly primitive barter economy where your expensive university education has little practical value. The taxation system that normally supports government services breaks down completely during major plague outbreaks. Local authorities can't collect taxes from dead citizens or fleeing merchants, which means they can't pay for basic services like street cleaning, law enforcement, or public health measures. This creates additional economic chaos that makes it even harder for private practitioners like yourself to maintain stable income streams. Your professional insurance, such as it is in medieval times, proves completely inadequate for the risks you're facing. The guild system that normally provides support for medical practitioners falls apart when most guild members are either dead or have fled. Professional associations that might help with emergency funding or equipment replacement simply don't exist during plague conditions. You're operating as a completely independent businessman in a collapsed economy. The competition for paying customers becomes fierce among the surviving medical practitioners. Other plague doctors, barber surgeons, and folk healers are all competing for the same small pool of families who still have money and haven't given up hope entirely. This drives prices down even further and creates pressure to offer increasingly desperate guarantees about treatment outcomes that you know you can't fulfill. Your attempts to maintain professional standards while facing financial ruin create ethical dilemmas that your university training never addressed. Should you continue charging full fees when you know your treatments don't work? Is it ethical to accept payment from families who can't afford your services? Should you refuse to treat patients who can't pay, even when they're desperately ill? These questions have no clear answers in medieval medical ethics. The regional economy's collapse affects every aspect of your financial situation. Trade routes are disrupted by plague outbreaks in distant cities, making exotic medical ingredients unavailable at any price. Agricultural production declines as farm workers die or flee, driving up food costs. Manufacturing slows as craftsmen abandon their workshops, making replacement equipment increasingly expensive. You're trying to operate a specialized medical practice in an economy that's reverting to subsistence-level survival. Your investment in medical education begins to look like a catastrophic financial mistake. The 7 years you spent at university, the money you paid for tuition and books, the opportunity costs of not learning a practical trade, all of these expenses were supposed to pay off through a lifetime of profitable medical practice. Instead, you've discovered that your expensive education prepared you for a profession that doesn't actually work and doesn't pay enough to justify the investment. The social stigma of poverty compounds your professional problems in ways that make financial recovery even more difficult. Medieval society judges people largely by their apparent wealth and status, and your shabby appearance and desperate behavior mark you as someone who has failed in life. Potential clients see your financial struggles as evidence that you're not good at what you do, creating a reputation spiral that makes it harder to attract paying customers. Your relationship with other professionals becomes strained by financial jealousy and competition. Lawyers and clerks who stayed safely in their offices while you risked your life treating plague victims are earning steady incomes from wills, property transfers, and administrative work generated by the crisis. Church officials receive donations and support from their congregations. Even common laborers who perform essential services can command premium wages during labor shortages caused by plague deaths. The knock on your door comes at dawn, accompanied by the sound of armed men and the unmistakable authority of people who aren't taking no for an answer. You're being summoned by the city magistrate to take on a new role that somehow manages to be even more despised than your current position as a failed plague doctor. Congratulations, you've just been appointed as the city's official quarantine enforcer, which is a fancy medieval term for the guy who locks families in their houses to die while their neighbors throw garbage at him. Your new duties are explained to you by a nervous-looking clerk who clearly drew the short straw in the municipal office. You're now responsible for identifying households with plague cases, marking their doors with red crosses or other warning symbols, and ensuring that no one enters or leaves these buildings for a period of 40 days. The number 40 was chosen because it appears frequently in biblical texts, not because anyone has the slightest idea how long plague victims remain contagious. It's medical policy based on scripture rather than science, which pretty much sums up your entire career experience so far. The equipment for your new position consists of a pot of red paint, a brush, some chalk for marking doors, and a ledger book for recording quarantined households. You're also given a badge of authority that you can wear on your leather coat. Though wearing a badge while dressed like a giant bird doesn't exactly project the kind of official dignity that medieval bureaucrats probably had in mind. The badge is supposed to protect you from interference by citizens who might object to your activities, but you suspect it will mainly serve as a target for people throwing things. Your first quarantine assignment involves a merchant's house where 3 children have developed fever and swollen lymph nodes. The family seems reasonably well-to-do, with a substantial stone house and evidence of comfortable living. They watch nervously as you examine the sick children through your plague mask, hoping that you'll pronounce their symptoms to be something other than plague. When you confirm their worst fears and begin mixing your red paint, the father offers you a substantial bribe to declare the house plague-free. The ethical implications of your new role become immediately apparent. You have the power to destroy families economically and socially by declaring them plague-infected, and you have almost no scientific basis for making these determinations. Medieval diagnostic methods can't reliably distinguish plague from other fevers and infections, which means you're essentially making life or death decisions based on educated guesswork and visual inspection through fogged-up glass eyepieces. The process of marking a house for quarantine becomes a neighborhood spectacle that turns you into the central figure in a medieval tragedy. As you paint the red cross on the front door, neighbors gather to watch and whisper among themselves. Children point at the marked house and ask their parents what it means. The marked family stands in their doorway, looking out at their community with expressions of despair and betrayal. You're literally branding them as outcasts in a ritual that feels more like a witch trial than a public health measure. The quarantine enforcement puts you in the position of imprisoning entire families based on the illness of one member. Medieval understanding of contagion is crude and inconsistent, but city officials have decided that anyone living in a plague house must be prevented from spreading disease to the broader community. This means you're locking up healthy children along with their sick parents, healthy servants along with their infected masters, and healthy extended family members who happen to be visiting at the wrong time. Your daily rounds through the city become exercises in medieval social control that reveal the profound class distinctions in plague treatment. Wealthy families get polite visits and careful examinations before you make quarantine decisions. Poor families get cursory inspections and are often quarantined based on rumors or complaints from neighbors rather than medical evidence. Your university education and professional training have transformed you into an instrument of class-based discrimination disguised as public health policy. The logistics of quarantine enforcement present practical problems that no one in city government thought to address. How do quarantined families obtain food and water? Who removes waste from houses where people can't leave? What happens when quarantined people run out of fuel for heating and cooking? These basic questions don't have good answers, which means you're implementing a policy that essentially sentences people to death by starvation and exposure rather than plague. The community's response to quarantine enforcement reveals the breakdown of social solidarity during plague outbreaks. Some neighbors organize to help quarantined families by leaving food and supplies outside their doors. Others see quarantine as an opportunity to settle old grudges by making false accusations against enemies. A few enterprising individuals start charging exorbitant prices to deliver necessities to quarantined households, turning human misery into a profitable business opportunity. Your interactions with quarantined families become increasingly disturbing as the psychological impact of imprisonment becomes apparent. People who were initially cooperative and understanding become desperate and hostile as days pass without relief. They beg you to let them out for just a few minutes to buy food or visit dying relatives in other houses. They offer bribes, make threats, and eventually resort to escape attempts that put you in the position of physically restraining plague victims. The legal authority behind quarantine enforcement is dubious at best, based more on emergency powers claimed by panicked city officials than on established law or precedent. You're operating under martial law conditions where normal legal protections have been suspended, but you have no training in law enforcement and no clear guidelines about what methods you can use to compel compliance. You're essentially making up police procedures as you go along, with predictably disastrous results. Historians still argue whether medieval quarantine measures were effective public health interventions or simply mechanisms for social control during crisis periods, but most agree that enforcement was inconsistent and often counterproductive. The lack of scientific understanding about disease transmission meant that quarantine policies were based more on fear and superstition than on medical evidence. The record-keeping requirements of your new position create additional burdens that interfere with your medical duties. You're supposed to maintain detailed logs of which houses are quarantined, when they were marked, how many people are inside, and what their condition is on each day. This paperwork takes hours to complete properly, and city officials periodically demand reports that require you to analyze trends and make predictions about the plague's progress based on your quarantine data. Your attempts to maintain medical care for quarantine patients while also serving as their jailer create impossible conflicts of interest. As a doctor, you should be focused on treatment and comfort for sick people. As a quarantine enforcer, you need to prevent them from leaving their houses regardless of their medical needs. When quarantined patients require treatments that aren't available in their homes, you have to choose between medical ethics and public health policy. The emotional toll of quarantine enforcement compounds the already overwhelming stress of plague medicine. You're not just watching people die from disease, you're actively contributing to their deaths by preventing them from seeking help or escaping dangerous conditions. The guilt and moral ambiguity of your role creates psychological problems that medieval understanding of mental health can't address. The economic implications of quarantine enforcement affect every aspect of city life in ways that municipal authorities didn't anticipate. When you quarantine a merchant's family, their business operations cease, affecting employees and customers throughout the community. When you lock up craftsmen and their households, essential services disappear. When you quarantine farmers during harvest season, food shortages become worse. Your quarantine decisions have ripple effects throughout the local economy. Your relationship with city officials becomes complicated as they demand both strict enforcement of quarantine policies and flexibility in dealing with politically important families. Wealthy merchants and noble households expect special treatment that allows them to maintain their business and social activities despite quarantine orders. You're expected to be rigorous with common citizens while making exceptions for people with political connections, creating a two-tier system that undermines the supposed medical rationale for quarantine. The physical dangers of quarantine enforcement extend beyond plague exposure to include violence from desperate families and hostile neighbors. People try to bribe you, threaten you, and occasionally attack you when you attempt to quarantine their households. You're operating in an environment where normal social constraints have broken down, and people are willing to use force to protect their families from what they see as a death sentence disguised as medical policy. Your plague costume becomes a symbol of oppressive government authority rather than medical expertise. When people see you approaching with your paint pot and ledger book, they don't think of you as a doctor trying to help, they see you as an agent of social control who has the power to destroy their lives with a few strokes of a brush. Your bird-like appearance makes you look even more sinister and inhuman as you go about the business of marking houses and imprisoning families. The quarantine policies you're enforcing reveal the fundamental tensions between individual rights and collective security during public health emergencies. Medieval legal and political theory doesn't provide clear guidance about when government authorities can restrict personal freedom to protect public health. So you're operating in a legal gray area where your decisions affect people's lives without clear constitutional or legal limitations on your power. The scientific basis for 40-day quarantine periods is non-existent, based on biblical numerology rather than medical observation. You begin to suspect that the quarantine system is more about creating an appearance of official action than about actually controlling disease transmission. The ritualistic aspects of marking houses and imprisoning families serve psychological and political functions that have little connection to medical effectiveness. The breaking point comes when you realize that everyone around you has completely lost their minds, and somehow you're expected to maintain your sanity while dressed like a medieval fever dream and carrying a bag full of medicines that would be more effective if you just threw them directly into the nearest fire. The psychological landscape of a plague-stricken city is like stepping into a painting by Hieronymus Bosch, except the demons are real and they're all asking you for medical advice. Your daily routine now involves navigating through neighborhoods where the line between reality and collective hallucination has become impossibly blurred. You encounter families who have convinced themselves that their dead relatives are merely sleeping and will wake up if fed properly. You meet merchants who continue conducting business with customers who died weeks ago, setting aside portions of imaginary profits for ghostly partners. The psychological stress of mass death has created a community-wide break from consensus reality that makes your bird costume seem almost normal by comparison. The folk remedies being attempted around you have evolved beyond traditional herbalism into full-blown magical thinking that would impress even the most credulous medieval chroniclers. You watch families bury protective amulets made from children's teeth under their doorsteps, convinced that primary dental remains have special power against plague. You encounter households where people wear necklaces of garlic bulbs not because they think garlic has medicinal properties, but because they believe vampires are spreading the disease through nighttime blood-drinking expeditions. Your medical training becomes completely irrelevant when faced with patients who have developed elaborate delusional systems about their conditions. You examine a merchant who insists that his bubonic swellings are actually eggs laid by demonic insects, and he wants you to perform surgery to hatch them so he can negotiate directly with the demons for better trade agreements. You encounter a mother who believes her feverish child has been possessed by the spirit of a dead relative and demands that you perform an exorcism rather than medical treatment. The city's collective response to plague has devolved into a carnival of superstition that makes your university education seem like a quaint academic exercise. Public squares fill with crowds participating in flagellant processions, where people whip themselves bloody in hopes of appeasing divine wrath through self-inflicted suffering. You watch these spectacles through your fogged-up glass eyepieces, wondering if you're observing genuine religious devotion or mass psychotic episodes triggered by social stress. The authorities you're supposed to report to have developed their own forms of plague-induced madness that interfere with any rational policymaking. The city magistrate has become convinced that plague spreads through written documents, so he's ordered all official records to be burned, destroying centuries of legal and administrative history in bonfires that fill the streets with smoke and ash. The captain of the City Watch has decided that plague victims can be identified by their shadows, leading to a campaign of shadow-based persecution that targets anyone whose silhouette appears suspicious. Your attempts to maintain professional medical standards become increasingly absurd when everyone around you is operating according to completely different rules of logic and causation. You try to explain germ theory concepts that won't be formally developed for several centuries, while your listeners nod politely and then ask whether you think their plague symptoms might be caused by angry household spirits or unfavorable astral influences from Jupiter's transit through Scorpio. The economic behavior of plague-stricken communities reveals forms of collective irrationality that would fascinate modern behavioral economists. You observe merchants accepting payment in currencies they've invented themselves: buttons, colored stones, or pieces of broken pottery that have acquired imaginary value through community agreement. You watch families trading their most valuable possessions for worthless trinkets that someone has convinced them possess protective magical properties. The religious responses to plague have evolved into syncretic belief systems that combine Christianity with pre-Christian paganism, folk magic, and personal revelations received through fever dreams. You encounter priests who have incorporated plague bacteria into their theological understanding as tiny demons that can be exorcised through proper ritual procedures. You meet congregations that have decided the plague represents the second coming of Christ and are preparing for the end times by giving away all their possessions and gathering in churches to await divine judgment. Your daily interactions with plague victims reveal the profound psychological impact of facing mass mortality without adequate explanatory frameworks. People develop elaborate personal mythologies to make sense of their experiences, convincing themselves that they've been chosen for special trials, that their suffering serves cosmic purposes, or that they possess secret knowledge about the true nature of reality that has been revealed through their proximity to death. The children's responses to plague conditions are particularly disturbing because they reveal how quickly social learning breaks down when adult authority figures have clearly lost control of the situation. You encounter groups of orphan children who have formed quasi-religious cults based on playground games, convinced that certain ritual behaviors will protect them from disease. You meet young people who have appointed themselves as prophets, delivering sermons about plague causation based on garbled versions of adult conversations they've overheard. Historians still argue whether medieval plague outbreaks triggered genuine increases in mental illness or simply revealed the fragility of social consensus under extreme stress, but most agree that the psychological impact of mass death created widespread behavioral changes that persisted long after the immediate health crisis had passed. The artistic and cultural productions emerging from plague-stricken communities reflect forms of collective creativity that seem to emerge from shared trauma. You observe street musicians performing songs that incorporate plague symptoms into romantic ballads, treating bubonic swellings as metaphors for unrequited love. You encounter poets who have developed elaborate verse forms based on the rhythm of plague victims' labored breathing, creating a new literary genre that celebrates suffering as aesthetic experience. Your role as a medical authority becomes increasingly surreal when people expect you to provide expert opinions about supernatural phenomena that fall completely outside your area of training. Families ask you to diagnose cases of demonic possession, to evaluate the medical implications of prophetic visions, and to provide professional assessments of miraculous cures that supposedly occurred through divine intervention. Your plague mask and university credentials apparently qualify you as an expert on all forms of unusual experience. The communication patterns within plague-stricken communities have devolved into forms of magical thinking that make rational discourse nearly impossible. You encounter people who believe that speaking the word plague aloud will summon the disease, leading to conversations conducted entirely through euphemisms and circumlocutions. You meet families who have convinced themselves that backward speech will reverse plague symptoms, resulting in household interactions that sound like recordings played in reverse. Your attempts to maintain scientific objectivity become complicated by the fact that some of the folk remedies being attempted around you actually seem to work occasionally, though for reasons that contradict everything you learned in medical school. You observe families using prayer and meditation techniques that appear to reduce pain and anxiety in plague victims, achieving better palliative results than your expensive pharmaceutical preparations. You witness community support systems that provide more effective comfort care than anything you can offer through individual medical intervention. The legal and judicial systems have adapted to plague conditions by incorporating supernatural elements that transform courtrooms into venues for magical thinking. You observe trials where defendants claim that plague spirits made them commit crimes, leading to legal proceedings that focus on exorcism rather than evidence. You encounter judges who base their decisions on astrological calculations and divine revelation rather than testimony and legal precedent. Your personal psychology begins to fragment under the constant exposure to collective insanity, and you find yourself questioning whether your university education represents genuine knowledge or just another form of elaborate delusion. The boundary between rational medical practice and superstitious folk healing becomes increasingly unclear when both approaches produce equally ineffective results in the face of plague mortality. The social hierarchies that normally structure medieval communities have been replaced by new forms of organization based on plague-related expertise and spiritual authority. You encounter former servants who have become neighborhood leaders because they claim to possess special knowledge about plague prevention. You meet merchants who have reinvented themselves as religious prophets, using their commercial networks to spread apocalyptic messages about the spiritual significance of mass death. Your daily observations of human behavior under extreme stress reveal psychological phenomena that won't be formally studied by academic psychology for several centuries. You witness examples of mass hysteria, collective delusions, trauma-induced personality changes, and social regression that would provide valuable case study material for modern researchers if anyone in medieval Europe had the conceptual framework to document and analyze these experiences systematically. The transformation of familiar urban spaces into landscapes of shared madness makes navigation through the city feel like movement through a fever dream where normal rules of cause and effect have been suspended. You walk down streets where every house displays different protective symbols: crosses, pentagrams, animal skulls, arrangements of colored stones, creating a visual environment that looks more like an outdoor museum of comparative superstition than a residential neighborhood. Your professional identity becomes increasingly unstable as you realize that the distinction between educated medical practice and folk healing has collapsed entirely under plague conditions. The treatments you learned in university work no better than the remedies being invented by desperate families, and your elaborate costume provides no more protection than the amulets and charms that everyone else is wearing. You're all equally helpless in the face of epidemic disease, but your expensive education has somehow made you less capable of accepting this reality with dignity. The walk home after your final house call feels different tonight, heavier somehow, as if the weight of all those failures has finally settled into your bones and decided to make a permanent residence there. Your leather boots echo against cobblestones slick with substances you've learned not to identify too closely, and with each step, you're carrying more than just the physical burden of your ridiculous costumerie, dragging behind you the accumulated psychological wreckage of a career that has transformed you from healer into harbinger, from doctor into demon, from hope into horror. The house you return to each evening sits at the edge of the city, far enough from the worst plague districts to maintain the illusion of safety, close enough that you can hear the constant tolling of funeral bells that has become the soundtrack of your existence. Your family waits for you, their wife, children, perhaps elderly parents, and every night you face the terrifying possibility that your work has made you the instrument of their destruction. You've spent your days moving between infected households, breathing contaminated air, touching plague-stricken patients, and handling contaminated materials, all while wearing protective equipment that you increasingly suspect is about as effective as wearing a paper bag over your head during a rainstorm. The decontamination ritual you perform before entering your own home has become elaborate and desperate, a nightly ceremony of guilt and fear that would be almost comic if it weren't so tragic. You strip off your leather costume piece by piece in the garden, hanging each item on poles you've erected for this purpose, creating a scarecrow version of yourself that stands guard over your family's safety while you're away. You wash yourself with harsh lye soap that burns your skin but never quite removes the psychological stain of the day's failures, scrubbing at hands that have touched too much death, trying to wash away memories that cling more persistently than any physical contamination. Your family's reaction to your return each evening has evolved over the weeks and months of your plague practice, shifting from welcome relief to cautious acceptance to barely concealed terror. They love you. They need the money your practice theoretically provides, but they also understand that you've become a walking vector of potential destruction, a beloved family member who might be carrying death in his clothing, his breath, his very presence. The children who once ran to greet you now watch from windows, their faces pressed against glass that serves as a barrier between their innocence and your contaminated experience. The psychological transformation that plague medicine has worked on your personality reveals itself most clearly in these domestic moments when you're no longer performing the role of medical professional and can simply be human. You find that you've developed habits of thought and behavior that would be appropriate for someone living in a war zone or a natural disaster area, but which are deeply disturbing when applied to ordinary family life. You've become hypervigilant about symptoms, examining every cough, fever, or complaint from your loved ones with the kind of clinical detachment that might be appropriate for patients but feels horrifying when applied to your own children. The conversations around your dinner table have taken on surreal qualities that reflect the broader breakdown of normal social discourse during plague conditions. Your family asks about your day, and you struggle to find ways to describe experiences that defy normal descriptive categories. How do you explain that you've spent 8 hours watching people die while feeling completely helpless to save them? How do you describe the sound a person makes when plague-related gangrene causes their extremities to literally fall off? How do you convey the smell of a house where an entire family has been dead for a week without causing your own family to lose their appetites permanently? The economic pressures that your failed medical career has created for your household add another layer of stress to family relationships that are already strained by the constant threat of infection. Remember those payment problems we discussed earlier? Well, they've now reached the point where your family's basic survival is threatened by your inability to collect fees for services that don't work. Your wife manages household finances with the skill of a medieval accountant, stretching inadequate resources to cover basic necessities while watching you risk your life daily for essentially no compensation. Your children's development is being shaped by their father's transformation from respected professional to community pariah, and you can see the psychological impact of this social degradation affecting their behavior and self-image. They've learned not to mention your profession when playing with other children, not to invite friends to your house, not to expect the kind of social status that normally accompanies having a university-educated father. They're growing up with the understanding that their father is both essential and despised, necessary and dangerous, learned and ineffective. The sleep that should provide escape from the psychological burdens of plague medicine has become another venue for processing trauma that your medieval understanding of mental health can't adequately address. Your dreams are populated by the faces of patients you couldn't save, families you've impoverished, communities you've helped destroy through your failures. You wake up exhausted, having spent the night reliving medical disasters and imagining even worse scenarios that might await you in the coming day. Your relationship with your spouse reveals the profound personal cost of choosing a profession that has transformed you into someone your family barely recognizes. The person who returns home each evening is not the same person who left. That morning. Plague medicine changes you in ways that accumulate over time, creating a psychological distance between you and your loved ones that has nothing to do with physical quarantine measures. You've become intimate with death and suffering in ways that normal people never experience. And that intimacy creates a barrier between you and ordinary human relationships. The religious and spiritual implications of your plague experience create additional complications for family life in a deeply Christian society. Your daily exposure to mass death and your complete inability to prevent it raise fundamental questions about divine providence, human suffering, and the meaning of existence that medieval theology doesn't answer satisfactorily. Your family watches you struggle with these questions, seeing their husband and father lose faith in both medical science and religious doctrine simultaneously. Your physical health, ironically, begins to deteriorate from the stress and poor working conditions of plague medicine even as you remain free from plague infection itself. The constant wearing of heavy leather clothing in all weather conditions causes skin problems and joint pain. The restricted breathing through your mask creates respiratory issues that have nothing to do with plague exposure. The psychological stress manifests in physical symptoms that your medieval medical training can't properly diagnose or treat. The community's attitude toward your family reflects the broader social dynamics of plague-stricken communities, where association with medical failure can stigmatize entire households. Your children face discrimination at school. Your wife encounters suspicious looks at the market, and your extended family begins to distance themselves from potential contamination that they perceive as both physical and social. You've become a source of shame and danger for everyone you love. Your attempts to maintain normal family relationships while processing the daily trauma of plague medicine create impossible psychological contradictions that medieval understanding of mental health can't resolve. You're expected to be a loving husband and father, while also serving as the community's primary contact with mass death and medical failure. These roles require completely different emotional responses and psychological frameworks, creating internal conflicts that manifest in mood swings, irritability, and withdrawal from family interactions. The long-term implications of your plague experience begin to affect your family's future planning in ways that reveal how deeply the crisis has disrupted normal life trajectories. Your children's education and career prospects are limited by their father's reputation and the family's reduced economic circumstances. Your wife's social relationships have been damaged by association with your failed profession. Your household's position in the community has shifted from respectable middle-class status to something approaching pariah status. Your family begins to discuss the possibility of leaving the community entirely, starting over in a place where your reputation as a failed plague doctor won't follow you. But the practical challenges of relocating during plague conditions make this option almost impossible to pursue. Travel is dangerous. New communities are suspicious of refugees from plague areas, and your specialized medical training isn't easily transferable to different economic and social contexts. The psychological burden of potentially having brought plague home to your own family creates a level of guilt and anxiety that affects every aspect of your domestic life. You find yourself constantly monitoring your loved ones for symptoms, interpreting every minor complaint as potential evidence of infection, living in constant fear that your professional activities have sentenced your own children to death. This hypervigilance creates an atmosphere of tension and fear that makes normal family life impossible to maintain. Your evening routine has evolved into a complex ritual designed to minimize both physical and psychological contamination. But these measures serve mainly to highlight how thoroughly your profession has invaded and disrupted your personal life. You can't simply come home from work like a normal person. You have to decontaminate, confess the day's failures, process traumatic experiences, and somehow transition from professional death witness to family man within the space of a few hours. The mirror reflection that greets you each morning reveals physical changes that document the toll of plague medicine more clearly than any written record. Your face has aged years in months, acquiring lines and expressions that reflect constant exposure to suffering and failure. Your posture has changed from the confident bearing of a university graduate to the defensive crouch of someone who expects to be blamed for things beyond his control. Your hands, once steady enough for delicate medical procedures, now shake with accumulated stress and anxiety. Historians still argue whether plague doctors were more likely to survive epidemic outbreaks than ordinary citizens, but most agree that the psychological and social costs of the profession often persisted long after the immediate health crisis had ended. The experience of serving as a plague doctor created forms of trauma and social isolation that could affect entire families for generations. The isolation that your profession has created extends beyond your immediate family to affect your relationships with neighbors, friends, and extended community members who once formed your social support network. People who used to visit your household now find excuses to avoid your company. Social invitations that once filled your calendar have dried up entirely. Your children's friends are forbidden by their parents from playing at your house, creating a bubble of social quarantine around your family that has nothing to do with actual medical risk. Your professional identity begins to fracture under the weight of constant failure and community rejection, leading to what modern psychologists might recognize as an identity crisis. You trained for years to become a healer, yet your work has made you a symbol of death and failure. You studied to join a respected profession, yet your practice has made you a community outcast. The disconnection between your professional aspirations and your actual experience creates cognitive dissonance that your medieval psychological framework can't resolve. The financial stress of your failed practice combines with the psychological trauma of daily exposure to death to create a compound crisis that affects every aspect of your family's life. You're simultaneously dealing with professional failure, economic insecurity, social ostracism, and constant fear of infectiona, combination of stressors that would challenge anyone's mental health and family stability. Your household becomes a pressure cooker of accumulated tension with no adequate release mechanisms. The religious questions that plague medicine has raised for you personally begin to affect your family's spiritual life in ways that create additional sources of conflict and uncertainty. Your wife continues to attend church regularly, but she faces questions from other parishioners about your work and its spiritual implications. Your children hear conflicting messages about whether their father is doing God's work or interfering with divine will. The theological confusion surrounding plague medicine creates spiritual uncertainty that compounds the family's other problems. Your relationship with your own parents, if they're still living, becomes another casualty of your plague medicine career. They invested in your university education with pride and expectation, seeing your medical degree as evidence of family advancement and social mobility. Your professional failure represents not just personal disappointment, but a betrayal of family aspirations and financial sacrifice. They struggle to understand how their successful, educated son has become a community pariah whose presence threatens everyone he loves. The daily routine of family life becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as the psychological burden of plague medicine accumulates over time. Simple activities like sharing meals, helping children with their studies, or engaging in casual conversation require enormous emotional effort because you're constantly processing traumatic experiences and managing anxiety about potential infection. You find yourself going through the motions of normal family life while feeling emotionally disconnected from the people you love most. Your attempts to protect your family from the psychological impact of your work create additional strain, as you try to maintain emotional barriers between your professional and personal lives. You develop elaborate strategies for compartmentalizing your experiences, creating mental walls between the horrors of plague medicine and the normalcy of domestic life. But these psychological defenses require constant energy to maintain and often fail at crucial moments, allowing traumatic experiences to spill over into family interactions. The community's perception of your family as contaminated and dangerous affects practical aspects of daily life in ways that create ongoing hardship and isolation. Merchants charge higher prices for goods sold to your household, viewing the economic relationship as inherently risky. Service providers, carpenters, seamstresses, laborers refuse to work on your property or demand premium payments for their services. Your family's integration into the normal economic and social life of the community becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. As you sit by your window tonight, looking out at a city where your failures have multiplied beyond counting, where your reputation has crumbled beyond repair, where your profession has transformed you into something you barely recognize, you find yourself wondering whether the plague will end before you doubt whether the disease will burn itself out, or whether you'll simply dissolve entirely into the psychological wreckage of a career that promised healing and delivered only death. The soft sounds of your sleeping family drift from the other room, reminding you of everything you have to lose, everything you've already lost, and everything you're still afraid of losing tomorrow. The darkness outside your window seems to whisper promises of rest, of peace, of an end to the endless cycle of failure and blame and death that has become your existence. But even in these quiet moments, you can hear the distant sound of someone coughing, someone calling for help, someone who still believes that a doctor in a bird costume might be able to save them from the inevitable. And despite everything, despite the failures, the hatred, the economic ruin, the social ostracism, the psychological trauma, and the constant fear, you know that tomorrow you'll put on that ridiculous leather coat once again. Because sometimes being useless is still better than admitting that there's nothing anyone can do. The weight of accumulated sorrow settles over you like a familiar blanket, heavy but somehow comforting in its consistency. You've learned to carry this burden, to function despite it, to find meaning in the simple act of bearing witness to suffering even when you can't alleviate it. Perhaps that's enough, you think, as sleep finally begins to claim you. Perhaps showing up, even in failure, is its own form of healing. Perhaps being present for people's final moments, even when you can't save them, serves a purpose that transcends medical success or failure. The morning will bring new patients, new failures, new grief. But tonight, in the quiet safety of your home, surrounded by the people you love and somehow haven't yet destroyed, you allow yourself to rest. The bird costume hangs in the garden like a scarecrow, keeping watch over your dreams, and for just a few hours, you can forget that tomorrow you'll have to put it on again. The church bells have stopped ringing. The city sleeps, if cities can sleep when so many of their children lie still forever. And you sleep too, dreaming perhaps of a world where doctors heal instead of harm, where knowledge conquers ignorance, where love is stronger than death. Tomorrow will bring its own sorrows, but tonight there is peace. The candlelight flickers lower now, casting gentler shadows across the pages of this medieval story. Your journey as a plague doctor draws to its close, not with triumph, but with the quiet dignity of endurance. Sometimes the most human thing we can do is simply to continue, to show up for others even when we feel broken ourselves, to offer presence when we cannot offer cures. The leather costume will hang in countless museums, a reminder of humanity's constant struggle against mortality. Those who wore it were not heroes or villains, but people trying their best with inadequate tools and impossible circumstances. They failed medically, but perhaps they succeeded in ways they never understood, offering comfort through presence, dignity through ritual, hope through the simple act of caring. Medieval Europe eventually emerged from its plague years, scarred but somehow stronger. Communities learned. Knowledge grew slowly. The bird-masked doctors faded into memory, replaced by better medicine and deeper understanding. Their suffering was not meaningless if it contributed, even in small ways, to the long human project of healing. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, remember that all of us are fighting battles with inadequate weapons. We're all wearing costumes that don't quite fit, trying to solve problems we don't fully understand. The plague doctor's struggle is our struggle, the attempt to bring light to dark places, even when our lanterns flicker and sometimes fail. Rest now. Let the weight of centuries settle gently around your shoulders like an old quilt. The bells have stopped ringing. The city dreams. And somewhere in that vast tapestry of human experience, there is room for both sorrow and hope, failure and persistence, endings and new beginnings. Sleep well, gentle dreamer. The morning will bring its own gifts.